Hello, awesome people. I hope you're having an awesome day. And as you've probably seen from the title, I have a guest with me today. So I'm sorry for posting a little late this week, but this is a really interesting episode, and I really look forward to sharing it with you guys. So, as a trigger warning, this episode does contain some details of depression, bullying, and suicide. So today I'm here with Brian. And so we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety and depression and quite a lot about his books and his work. So, Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. Honored to be here. Honored to share some of the stories and experiences with some of your listeners. I'd like to say that I am really just a dude, like a guy who has been through some of the same things that people listening to this podcast will have been through. But if I wanted to talk about my background a little bit, I am the author and owner of Get Out of Your Head, which is a website and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. So I do that through a myriad of different ways, right? I've got two books out, one on anxiety, one on depression. I have a blog that I contribute to regularly, and then I go on podcasts like the one that we're on right now.
So, first, I want to talk about your books. So, what inspired you to really write a book about mental health?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think it's kind of funny because I look back a little bit and I think to myself, like, when I actually wrote the book, the first one, or when I got started on it, I was like a little bit naive, right? I kind of said to myself, like, oh, I was going through a lot of anxiety throughout the 10 years prior to that. And I had finally made a decent amount of progress. And I came up with these strategies for myself that I was actually putting into practice. And when I was using them, they were alleviating a lot of my anxiety, or at least, mitigating it to a decent degree. And I just I felt so relieved in a way that I had finally made progress on this thing that I had dealt with so mightily or struggled with so mightily for so many years that I really wanted to present that information to other folks and help them overcome some of the battles that they had gone through. I think one of the things when I say like maybe I was a little naive was at that time, it's kind of funny, right? Speaking to the idea of like I'm just a guy who talks about his experiences and relays some of the strategies that he's come up with. Somebody might say to me like, "Hey, why are you writing a book on the subject? You're not a doctor, you're not a clinician, something like that." And I guess at the time, I just kind of had this irrational sort of confidence where I was like, this was so helpful for me, all the stuff that I'm going to talk about that I feel the need to share it with the world, even though because I was so confident in it, I was almost overlooking the fact that like there's thousands, millions of doctors out there who are much more well versed in this stuff than I am, who have spent years studying it, treating different clients and things like that. So it was sort of just in some way, it's almost if you talk to somebody who starts a business, right? It's like on the other side of having run a business for a long time, somebody might say to you like, I now know how difficult it is, and I wouldn't go do it again. One of the reasons that people start companies is because they don't know how challenging it can be. And if you have all those ideas in your head, you'd never do it in the first place. So for me, it was sort of that same kind of experience where it was like, if I knew, how challenging it was to write a book and to get a brand started and whatnot, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But I was just so excited about the progress that I had made in my own journey that I wanted to share it with other folks. And, even though that journey has been difficult along the way, both in terms of like the psychological aspect, as well as, running the business, getting the books out there, sharing the message. It's one of those things that once you get started, you learn some things that kind of keep you going and maybe even alter your course a little bit. But, it's like you look back and you say, well, I'm not anywhere close to where I was 2 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. But the progress along the way has maybe altered my journey, but also kept me going. So it's definitely been an interesting ride.
Yeah, I can really relate to what you just said because for me, I created this podcast to firstly, I like to say that I'm helping people, but honestly, I don't really know. But for me, it has helped me a lot to talk to people and for you to write your book to share your methods. And for me, that's what I'm doing. And like you said, I'm meeting a lot of doctors and therapists and psychologists and some I met like a football coach and just a lot of different people. And I'm just like a 13-year-old girl who's like going, like trying to get past school and fighting through mental health and all that. And the thing that's a little weird about me is like a lot of people has like gone through their mental health journey for quite a while, and like for you said like over 10 years, but for me, I'm I think when I really started to struggle with mental health, it was like 2 or 3 years ago. But for me, it was like 2 decades. And sometimes that's why I use my podcast to teach people and to really talk to them and to relate to them. So I feel like what you're doing and your books, they're really great. And I really appreciate you for coming out and to talk to other people about your books and anxiety and depression.
Absolutely. And thank you. I would say, like, thank you for the compliments, but also thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, I think that when you look at the mental health space in general, it's sort of futile to put some sort of like label on things of, hey, I've only done this much work. I've only been doing my podcast for X amount of months, X amount of years. This is, at the end of the day, a community, right? We are talking to the community of folks who are suffering through some of these conditions. And so any way that we can contribute to that, I think that's really important. And it sort of does us a disservice to say like, hey, I've only done this much, right? It's sort of the same thing of like, I'm kind of using maybe the wrong comparison. I'm not trying to say that mental health is charity or anything like that, but we wouldn't say, I was only able to donate $50 to that organization, right? Yeah. When somebody else was able to donate 1,000. It's the act itself. It's the fact that we're out here, we care, we're trying to make an impact. And I think you're definitely doing that. And also one of the other things too, right, is like, we need a lot more resources in the teenage space. And so I think you're carving out a niche for yourself where it's like somebody who's 13 might not want to go read a book that was written by a 40-year-old doctor. No disrespect to that doctor, but they just might not be able to, speak to the different subject matters in the right tone. So, giving listeners a platform like the one that you're providing here, I think it's monumental.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you just said, because for me, I'm never going to read like a biography or a book about mental health, like a book with like a doctor wrote with like a lot of medical terms. Like I wouldn't understand that because I'm young and I'm not that smart. So for me, I usually just like, for other teens like me, we just like go on YouTube, watch videos, and go on Netflix and watch movies. So podcasting is a little different because I don't have a lot of friends who listen to podcasts, and teens, they don't always listen to podcasts. Like for I think most of my friends prefer listening to music. And so a lot of my audience, like I'm targeting teens, but a lot of them are also adults that are trying to learn about teens. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate their support and how they care about like teens. So this brings me on to the next topic, and something I'm really interested in, like about your books. It's depression, and how I want to know how you got through that and how your books helped you or how your writing helped you.
Sure. Yeah. I think I'm trying to give like a little bit of background, but also answer the actual question. I think for me, anxiety I think anxiety and depression hit people differently, right? Not only the amount of time, but the degree to which it affects them. I've always felt as though anxiety for me is mostly specific events on the calendar. So like if I have, let's say, a public speech coming up that I have to give, like I'm anxious for the amount of time that exists until that event arrives, but I'm usually not all that anxious after that, right? If the event that I am considering has passed, then usually my anxiety goes away relatively quickly, and that's sort of that. Depression for me has been longer lasting and not necessarily tied to anything specifically. It's sort of what I've dealt with in the depression space has been more tied to a term called dysthymia, which is more like low grade depression that lasts for a year, a couple of years, something like that. So, with anxiety, I felt as though if I could learn some strategies, I could get myself out of how I was feeling in the moment, because it was most of the my experiences of anxiety were pretty acute. Whereas depression, it was sort of like this, almost cloud hanging over me sort of thing for a long time. And so that was a little bit more difficult to wade through. But that was also like kind of the tone that I strike in my second book, which was basically sort of saying like, hey, depression is this really challenging thing to fight off or to get through. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to present the content in a friendly and supportive way. I'm going to hit you with a lot of different strategies that you might be able to implement to maybe make yourself feel a little bit better. There's also a lot more like philosophy in the second book, just sort of the way that we look at the world, the way that we look at life and approach things. And then, I think in a lot of ways, it's like depression is sort of like, it really is a battle, right? For folks to get out of bed each day, continue to fight on when things don't look so good, especially when like, again, I think for folks, it can sometimes be like a specific thing, right? I lost a loved one, and for that reason, I am depressed. But I think most of the time it's usually more than that, or a little bit more vague than that. And that's why it can be so difficult to deal with. And so it really becomes sort of this all out battle of like, hey, you load up the cannons, you load up the guns, and whatever you need to use to help yourself through this battle, you use it. So that was the overall approach of the second book. I'd be happy to jump into, some of the specific ideas, some of the specific strategies, but I think I'll kind of stop there and let you ask some more questions.
Yeah, it's okay. You can ask me questions too, because I don't really see podcasts as like an interview kind of thing. So it's not like me interviewing you, it's just like a conversation. So I really liked what you said about depression, because for me, I also went through like, I don't know if you could call it like a phase, but it's been like 2 years, and sometimes there's like some highs and some lows, and there wasn't really a specific type of like problem, like a specific problem that caused my depression, and it just really came out of nowhere, and it got really bad at the start, but then afterwards it kind of like, it was just like what you said, like a cloud over your head, and it was a cloud over my head, and it wasn't that bad, but it was just like always there, something like bothering me. So like a really interesting question I've been like thinking about is, I want to ask you, for you, what was the most painful thing about depression?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Like as we were talking about earlier, before we jumped on the podcast here, nothing is off limits. I'm happy to talk about anything specifically. My own journey was sort of like something of like a quarter life crisis, just understanding that like life is short. Unfortunately, we're all mortal, right? We're all going to die one day. And sort of like this overwhelming sort of, it all hit me at once of like, I had read a bunch of literature on climate change. I had lost my grandmother. I was in a situation, a job situation where I thought that when I got this job, everything would be amazing. And then I found myself in that job and I actually didn't like it whatsoever. And so it was sort of all these forces coming together at once that made me feel hopeless, I guess. And it was that hopelessness that was really, the most difficult part of the depression. I think in general, I sort of describe or define depression as hopelessness and helplessness, right? It's sort of this feeling of like, and that's why it feels so bad, right? It would be one thing to be like, hey, I'm in pain right now, but the pain is going to go away. When you are depressed, whether it's true or not, what your mind is telling you is that nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to get better. Maybe even your brain is telling you that this entire thing that you're dealing with, like, your entire life is hopeless, is meaningless, or something like that. Right. And so it was those thoughts and beliefs that were really pervasive for me and really challenging. There were days where it was like, I was just so far in my own head and it was difficult to wade through those things. But I think, again, kind of coming back to the idea of depression being a battle, right? Like showing up each day, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort and courage. And I think just methodically and slowly and continually applying some of the strategies that help you ward off depression, I think that's how you eventually get through it. It's not always, the cleanest and prettiest thing in the world, but you do keep going.
Yeah, because depression, like you said, it's not clean and everything's really messy, and it's also associated with a lot of different disorders. And for me, that's anxiety, and I have social anxiety and bipolar, and those two, like, and depression mixed together. It's kind of messy. And like for a lot of teens like me and my friends who have depression, there's like a lot of self-harm, like, which is really common in teens, and a lot of like suicidal thoughts and suicidal, like some, like, for a lot of people they attempt to suicide, and that is, like what you said, a really big feeling of hopelessness. And for me, usually I'm just really tired. Like, I don't want to get out of my bed, and sometimes I just want to sleep all day and not move and not take showers and not go clean myself and not eat. And so that's what for me is really different, like, to physical disorders and physical illnesses, because physical illnesses people can help, but depression, sometimes you feel like people can't really see it, and when you tell them, you feel like you're attention seeking. So I just think depression is really not a clean thing, and so I really, like, I can really relate to everything you're saying, and yeah, I agree with everything you're saying.
Yeah, it's definitely not clean. I think one of the things that I talk about in the second book is the notion that, like, we know how we feel, right? I'm sure there is somebody on the planet who may say they are depressed to seek attention.
Mhm.
Maybe one person, maybe a few people, right? But I think for the most part, right, it's like we if somebody's dealing with depression, like, I think you have to believe them, right? And you have to say, like, this understand this is probably really difficult for them, right? Again, I'm not a clinician, but I sort of approach these things as if I were a psychiatrist, just being able to, get into the mind of that person, and have some empathy for them and understand what they're feeling. It is really terrible that we lose folks to mental health disorders, including depression. And I think that just speaks to how serious the struggle is, right? It does break my heart to hear of, not just teenagers, I'd say anyone, but specifically teenagers, to hear that, they see things as so hopeless that they don't want to live anymore. And again, I mean, it's not casting judgment. That is sort of part and parcel for depression itself, but it's also, again, it is heartbreaking to hear that sort of stuff. I think to anyone who is listening, just know that, you're not alone. There are other people going through what you're going through right now, and that doesn't necessarily, like, it's not to downplay it, not to say, like, hey, everybody's going through what you're going through, so suck it up, or anything like that. It's actually the complete opposite, right? It's saying, like, hey, you may feel as though your current state is hopeless and things will never get better. But in reality, and this is one of the reasons I love, like, data and science and statistics, is there are a lot of folks out there, actually, like, 1 in 5 people across the US will suffer from depression at some point in time. And a lot of those folks will actually, they'll recover from what it is that they're experiencing. So it's sort of like being able to get the perspective that, this too shall pass, right? What I'm experiencing today could be fleeting. It could, it could also last a year, a couple of years, something like that, but you could get through it. And I think also one of the difficult things with being a teenager is, your body is changing, right? You have all these hormones coursing through you and whatnot. And sometimes, like, your body creates I guess a chemical cocktail, right? Where it's like, we have no idea what's going on. We feel awful because our bodies are growing and
Yeah.
changing. And so it's like, just to remember to give yourself some time, and be patient with yourself, as difficult as that can be.
Yeah, because for teens, my hormones are crazy and I don't really know what I'm doing. And I'm like out of control most of the time. And I'm just running around and being like a stupid teenager and everything. And that's, like, it really relates to depression, because like you said, even though, like, some people might be doing it for attention, but at the end of the day, most people aren't doing it for attention, and it's something that really hurts. And um when someone, like you said, like, when you hear about people's stories about people losing their lives to depression and other mental disorders, and especially teens, it's really heartbreaking. And for me, it always hurts me a lot when I hear about teens, especially ones that are younger than me, because I've heard about, like, 9-year olds, 11-year olds, and I mean, like, 8-year-olds, they're so young and like they don't even know a lot about the world yet, and they're here worrying about like these huge problems. And even for me, I don't think like 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, I don't think like so why is there like a huge majority of teens facing this mental health problem? It shouldn't even be this many teens facing this problem, because like being a teen itself is already really challenging, and it's the same for any other age. There's always challenges, and mental health is just like this challenge like on the side, and it's so hard and so painful, and it takes so much effort to go through it. And like you said, it's always like at the end of the day, like trying to beat depression is just like holding on to the hope that there will be an end. But for a lot of people there wasn't, and it hurts for a lot of people, and that's why it hurts me to see a lot of people in that situation, and especially their families too, because it could have been me, it could have been my parents that were like at my funeral, and like I could have succeeded like an attempt, and for like the other kids who have succeeded, like it really hurts for me to really think about them and to think about what they had to go through.
Yeah, I mean, a lot to cover there. It again, it just to stress, like it really is heartbreaking to think about some of the things that you talked about, to hear about really young kids struggling. I think at the same time, it's important to acknowledge the fact, right? Like I always thinking, kind of taking this mindset of thinking as if I were a clinician, even though I'm not. I always want to give proper weight to the experience that someone is having. I think, especially when we look at teenagers, middle school students, like that age is tough. Like it's really difficult. I'm not going to lie. Kids are mean. You go to school every day. Kids can be so critical of one another, just like downright rude, brutal. I have some young cousins where I've heard of stories where maybe not them, but their friends will get picked on in school, and then they'll go home and feel as though, hey, I'm out of school, I'm not going to get bullied anymore. When in reality, there's now sort of these trends growing where kids get on social media after school, and if someone who's being bullied doesn't show up to social media when they get home, they'll get bullied even more when they get to school the next day. And then if they do go on social media, the bullying continues there. And so it's like sort of this catch 22 where damned if you do, damned if you don't. And yeah, just again, really want to say like it can be very difficult to be a teenager. Again, not only is your body changing a lot, but your peers are changing too, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty. And again, kids are just downright mean. And it's not to say that like, that any one period of our lives is necessarily easier or harder than another, but that is definitely a particularly challenging point in our lives. And I think it's just to, again, remember that things will change, things will eventually get better, but it's also giving some gravity to that experience of, being a teenager, and how much uncertainty and angst comes with that situation.
Yeah, and your point about like bullying essentially, um it's tough because like now with social media and like in the US, like for TikTok and for Instagram and all the other types of social media, like kids now are getting like cyberbullied and bullied online and not just in school. And for me, I'm pretty lucky to be in quite a good school with like pretty good kids and nice kids, but a lot of other schools, like kids are just really really mean, and bullying, it's just like a huge problem, and a lot of kids who are bullying other kids, like the bullies have been like bullied themselves, and that's just like a cycle. And we're like basically we're all just waiting for like the bullies to really stop bullying other people, and for the victims to not become bullies, because in many cases I've seen um like younger kids, like year ones and year twos, like when they were bullied, and when they got older and when they were like in year six and in middle school and high school, they bullied the younger kids because they had to like release the anger that they had stored up since they were really low. And so like for me that really it's really important. Like I've always been thinking about it to like stop bullying and in all schools, and like not only for this like for teens but also for like older kids, and like because it's happening everywhere and for a lot of different kids and a lot of different ages. So it's just really important to just really stop that trend.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you touch upon a really important thought, which is the idea that, somebody who is inflicting pain upon others, they are either projecting an emotion that they are feeling inside of themselves, or they are dealing with anger, insecurity, vulnerability. They're trying to make sense of difficult emotions in ways that are really unhelpful and, downright harmful. But it's remembering that, right? Is even though it might not, if you're being bullied in the moment, it might not necessarily get you anywhere, but like being able to step back and say like, hey, this person, they might be doing this because they hurt themselves. And having that insight to be able to say like, this my bullier is still just human, right? And maybe there's something that they're dealing with that they don't even know. And it's, again, it's sort of hard to act on, but I think I'm not trying to say we should have compassion for bullies because they're mean and they stink. But at the same time, right, it's like understanding that there might be something that they're not dealing with. And, again, it's not always going to help us in the moment, but understanding that in time, that person is going to have to atone for what it is that they're dealing with. And, maybe down the road, you hear of stories all the time where you go to a high school reunion or something like that, and somebody who, used to be the class bully comes around and is sort of, I don't know, figured it out for themselves, right? And they come back and they're a nice person and they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I used to do that stuff to you guys all the time. I guess just sort of, having I think the important thing, the distinction to make that can be helpful there is to say like, this person might be bullying me for reasons that they don't even understand. And it might not necessarily be an attack on me, right? I might not need to take this and say like, I'm being bullied because I'm a loser, because I'm unworthy or something like that. It could have everything to do with the bully.
Yeah, because like I agree with everything you're saying, because bullies usually they have experienced the exact same thing, and they're facing problems that like the victims doesn't know about. And the like like you said, like I'm not trying to be like really nice to the bullies and like thinking they're really good humans, but of course they're doing a bad thing like bullying kids, and that's really simple. But to also think about how they were also hurt in a way, and that's like the only way to stop bullying is to also help the bullies and to also help the victims and to help both sides. And so I'm really glad you talked about this topic. And so before we end, I like to have a conversation about your books, because you mentioned previously that you wanted to share like some points in your books. So if you want to do that, you can talk about your books.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I do have a little bit of construction noise in the background here. So sorry if you hear any of that.
No,
Yeah,
I don't, I don't
we could
hear
cover the,
it.
sorry, go ahead.
I just don't hear any noise. It's okay. So
Okay,
you have to
awesome.
unmute yourself. It's okay.
Yeah, well, we have about 5 or 8 minutes. So I think, we could jump into book one quickly, just because I think that there are some quicker takeaways that we'd be able to cover in the time that we do have left. So my first book is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. And the book itself, I think that word toolkit is really important, or at least I stress it a lot, which is what I mean when I say toolkit is like the first book itself it's a compilation of all the different strategies that I had come up with for dealing with anxiety at that point in my life. And so the notion is that I'm going to throw all those ideas at you or at the reader. And rather than have that person say, well, I don't like this book because I didn't agree with all of these strategies, I come out and I say, the idea is to put all of these techniques on the page and present them to you in a way that you can digest them in a comfortable fashion. And then you can process them and say, hey, I liked this strategy. I liked that one. I didn't like this one so much. This one wasn't as helpful for me, things like that. Right. And then at the end of the day, take those strategies that you've identified and put them into your proverbial mental health toolkit. And then that way, the next time you find yourself in an anxious situation, you can say to yourself, okay, I identified those 4 strategies from Brian's book that I liked. And right now, I think I'm going to try out, this one. I'm going to try out this other one. Number one, I think different strategies work for different folks. And then number 2, different techniques work better in certain situations than others. So that's the idea of the book. I think to give folks some content that they could potentially walk away from this podcast with and implement immediately. Do you want to jump into 1 or 2 of those techniques?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I have this, in this first book, in the first half of it, I have this framework that I call the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And it's basically just like a simple 10-part, list or checklist that you can walk through in order to mitigate in the moment fear when it arises. So why don't we just jump through 1 or 2 of those? I can quickly describe them, leave a minute for any questions, and then we can wrap up.
Okay.
Cool. So, I could, there's so many, I love them all kind of equally, or I enjoy them. But I think, why don't we start with step number 5? So that's recite a powerful mantra. So for folks listening, if you're not familiar with mantras, they're basically just short, empowering phrases. So for example, right, like saying to yourself, everything is going to be okay. That could be a mantra. Another one could be like, I am capable of everything that I want to achieve in life, or something similar. So I give a few examples in the book. If you want to pick up the book and check them out, feel free to do that. But the general idea is to come up with a few of these phrases and then use them when you're feeling stressed. So, let's say we're going to take a math test and we're not feeling confident in our abilities. We're feeling anxious, something like that. Your mantra could be like, I'm going to perform well on this exam, or I'm good at math. The concept behind a mantra is it allows us to get out of our heads, to get away from overthinking by giving our minds something else to focus on. So rather than saying to ourselves, oh my goodness, I don't know how I'm going to do. What if I do poorly? Like I'm seeing myself in the exam room. I'm really nervous, something like that. We really just need a quick distraction.
Yeah.
And so reciting a mantra gives us that distraction, allows us to put our focus elsewhere, right? To put our focus on the words that we've come up with for ourselves. And then let's see, I guess let's also quickly cover step 8. So step 8 in this list says, get back to the present moment. And so there's a bunch of different ways that we could become present, right? Like we could do some deep breathing. We could go into a meditation session, something like that. But the general idea is that when we're feeling anxious, we are typically thinking about something that has yet to occur, right? We're saying, oh, I have that math test next week. And because I have it, I'm nervous right now. I'm thinking about how I'm going to perform. I'm thinking about failing, receiving a poor grade, something like that. So reminding ourselves to get back to the present moment tells us, like, okay, we are not in that exam room right now. I know it's off in the distance and it's sort of scary, but what am I doing right now, right? I may be hanging out with my friends. I may be recording a podcast, cooking dinner, something like that. So it's a reminder to shift our focus back to the here and now. And to the degree that we can, forget about some of those scary things hanging off in the distance.
Yeah, I will definitely try out like your methods, because I also like, for me, I like talking to myself, like especially like in front of a mirror and talking to myself. Like I used to find it a little weird, but then it does help. So I'll definitely like try your methods out. So like for my podcast, like for me, when I first started, it was for me to like talk about my problems, because I recorded some a long time ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, when I first like had like low problems. And I just added an intro and an outro. And I was like, oh, this is a podcast. But then I started like looking through websites, and I realized like how big of a community podcasting is. So like for all of my listeners, like whether if it's like you writing a book or like recording a podcast, like just helping yourself and helping others, it's always worth it. So Brian, thank you so much for being here and like adjusting to like the 12-hour time difference and scheduling the call with me. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you for having me. Just want to reiterate, like, what you're doing, helping teenagers with, mental health disorders, even if you impact 2 people, 10 people, 1,000 people, the number doesn't matter so much. Your intentions are amazing. And I think the fact that you are getting out there and talking about these things yourself. I think it's going to help not only you but a lot of folks in the future. And I just commend you for that. It's really admirable.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. So, as usual, before we end this, I would like to remind you to please reach out for help. Please talk to a trusted adult if you're feeling down or unwell. You can also call crisis hotlines, and if you're in an emergency, please call your local emergency services. Of course, you can talk to me for a chat or for some teenage advice, but I'm not trained and not professional, so I would suggest talking to an adult or a professional in this area first. Please do not hesitate to seek help. Before we finish this episode, I would like to say thank you for listening. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can add your suggestions, feedback in my Instagram bio. And I've also started preparing for an episode where I will read out your confessions and any questions you have on mental health. So if you would like to submit one, please go to my website, which you could see on my podcast bio and all my platforms I am live on. And lastly, if you're interested about my guest episodes, please go to my website to find more information on that. So I hope that helps. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to my other episodes and I hope you have an awesome day. Bye!